Feels like those people who you've lost are never really truly gone.
To me, I feel like there's so much to learn from death towards life. We're not just talking about it.
People don't stop living because they're dying.
This is not a dying person. This is a growing person.
And dying is a reflective process that draws you inward. And part of that process is they have very meaningful dreams and visions that are overwhelmingly comforting and therapeutic.
Welcome to the In Search of More podcast. I am your host, Eli Nash. Join me weekly on my quest for more from myself and more from this world. We'll see you on the other side. Hi, I'm sitting here with Dr. Christopher Kerr. Dr. Christopher Kerr is a doctor up in Buffalo and works with a lot of people. What fascinated me about his work and why I'm interested in sitting down is he works with a lot of people towards the end of their life, and there's a lot to learn about life from death. So I'd love to hear more. Obviously, I know some of that in researching, but for those people who are just, my audience who's just hearing about you for the first time, can you talk about some of the maybe the less tangible things you've done, the end-of-life experiences, the ELEs, I believe you call them?
Yeah.
Yeah, some of those experiences, and as we go into the other part of the conversation, some of those questions I have for you, I'd love if you explained some of that.
Sure. So when I'm a hospice and palliative care physician, so I do treat a lot of patients at the end of their life. And long ago, my colleagues in nursing and social work and chaplaincy made me very aware that there's the objective side of dying that we see, the grimness of it, the physical lessening of it. But then there's also the patient's experience, the inward part of dying, kind of the view from the bed. And
the view from the
view from the bed, right? Perspective. And what you learn very quickly is that that dying patients have a unique perspective, a unique vantage point, and which is understandable. And dying is a reflective process that draws you inward. And part of that process is they have very meaningful dreams and visions that are overwhelmingly comforting and therapeutic. And in attempting to clinically validate these as real and significant, we began, doing about probably 15 years worth of study and publishing about 8 or so manuscripts on this topic.
One of the things I came across is that in your amongst your team, it would be common to say, "Oh, this person is having certain kinds of dreams. They must be near the end of their life."
Yes. Yeah.
You'd start seeing those sort of correlations.
And we proved that. So what we did is we followed people several weeks and sometimes months before death, and we asked them daily, basically, what do you experience? We used surveys that were quantifiable, and we found an increasing frequency of these events as they approached death. And more specifically, the content changed. As you got nearer to death, the more likely you were to see people who you knew and you loved.
Who were alive or who had passed?
Who had passed. As you get closer to death, it seems to be people who had predeceased you. And not just anybody. It was people who secured you in love, unconditionally loved you. It drew on your most significant loving relationships.
In Search of More podcast has a sponsor. Officially, okclarity.com is the place for anyone in the Jewish community, whether you're from, not from, religious, not religious, all that's cool, to find a therapist, psychiatrist, coach, nutritionist, anyone in the wellness space. So this ad is both for those people looking for any of the above. Find the right one. You can go on their website, scroll through their choices. If you don't find someone, they have a concierge service. Reach out to them, describe the issue, and they will help you. I've recommended many people their platform and have only heard good things. If you're a wellness professional, I also recommend joining the directory. They will get you business if you're good at what you do. OK Clarity also has an amazing WhatsApp status. Check them out there. We'll post a link, their website, WhatsApp, in our emails, and wherever you're watching this, in the show notes. Check them out and let them know the In Search of More podcast sent you. So if maybe someone had a very close relationship with grandma, then close to the end of life, they start having dreams. And was there a certain content in that dreams beyond them just being in it?
Yeah, we did a paper where we actually published a lot on the content. Very little is said, but everything seems to be understood. They feel a presence, they feel the comfort, they feel that they're not alone, they feel reassured, a sense that somebody was waiting for them. Those are kind of the overarching themes.
And for the patient who's experiencing the dreams, do they understand it the way you do, that this is a preparation for death? Is it giving them that sense?
Yeah, it's really
Beyond
interesting. They don't come out of these experiences needing to analyze it, needing for it to be, they just come out with a sense of knowing. I mean, if you lost a parent as a child and you're at the end of your life and you feel the presence of that parent, you don't need a translation to it. So they seem to understand intuitively, which is very different than near-death experiences where they're structurally changed. They have some kind of epiphany or understanding, or have to go back and tell people things. That doesn't happen, which is just because the time for that sort of stuff is over, right? And yeah.
so these dreams give a sense of peace to them.
Yeah, a sense of being put back together. Time and distance seem to go away, and the sense of connecting back to the most formative relationships you've had. And they're overwhelmingly comforting.
Fascinating. Is there a way, when you're looking at this in a clinical lens, is there a way to view this without believing in an afterlife, without some of those, without adopting a spiritual worldview?
Yeah, we deliberately didn't.
So how is it understood without that lens?
It's a couple of things. First of all, what we did very clearly was we used death as the end point, and we didn't in any way, shape, or form try to interpret that to the paranormal, the afterlife, or religion. All we were doing was translating the words of our patients to what they were telling us without assigning it an editorial. And we viewed dying as this kind of mystery of itself, and we were just trying to capture it from the experience side of the patient. So it was not our role. We were very clear, and to participate in the study, there was an understanding that we weren't using their words to reinforce our notion of what life is after death, if there is life after death. The meaning in these experiences just seemed to be understood by the patient, and sometimes it was less about the religious symbolisms were actually very rare, almost absent, but the tenets of faith, love, forgiveness were everywhere. And there's a great article written by a theologian who basically said, the end of our life, patients don't talk about God in terms of theology; they talk about it where they learned God, which was usually through their families, through love, and those tend to be the themes. But they don't come out of it with this great enlightenment. It just feels more like it should, like they're back with their people. They feel whole.
Understood. And how has this shifted your own perspective, or how have you seen it shift the perspective of the people who are working with you? Meaning, to me, I feel like there's so much to learn from death towards life. We're not just talking about it. We want to inform us.
I think where we end up is there's a couple of things. Is one, we don't understand the etiology. It's really important to that these patients aren't confused. Like, we filmed a lot of them, right? And that footage that became part of a Netflix special as well as a PBS documentary. So we filmed them deliberately so people would understand these people aren't confused. These are university approved studies. So you
mean they're not losing their minds?
Oh, hell no. Some of these people are living
Right.
alone, doing their taxes and driving their cars. They are in a university study. They have to consent. And every time they do participate in the study, they have to be screened for confusion. So these people are cognitively intact. A lot of them just look like you and me, quite honestly. Some you can obviously tell are sick. So yeah, they're very much intact. I think where I end up, is I don't understand necessarily the source of this. but just have reverence for it. That I can't show you where this is in the brain, but I can't show you where love is either. And that I think it's a perspective that we don't have to understand because we're not going through it. None of us have actually gone through the dying process.
Right.
And again, these don't resemble the near-death reports, so there's no white light tunnels, great meaning revealed. Yeah, I think it's a more hopeful story. It feels like those people who you've lost are never really truly gone from you.
Right. And they're kind of, I mean, the way I heard almost, I understand you want to separate it, but for me, I guess for my worldview, I don't have to. I didn't do the study like you did. Is they're ushering you into that next stage.
Yeah, and there are absolutely
whatever
people
that is.
who there are a lot of people who feel that, but it doesn't come as a revelation. It just feels very natural to them. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Right. And I understand that idea, the knowingness of something versus having to prove or intellectually come to a decision.
And we did a very interesting study where we looked at dying as post-traumatic and questioned whether there's post-traumatic growth. So if dying is a trauma, is there growth within the dying process? And
what do you mean by that?
Well, it's like, so there's negative experiences like war, and we certainly understand the negative and traumatic effects of those sorts of experiences. But is there also meaning in negative, otherwise seemingly negative experiences? And so there's measures for post-traumatic growth, and we applied it to people who were having end-of-life experiences. And what we found was they were actually learning and adapting and gaining insight right up into the last days of life. So there's value in this, it seems like, for people. So there's this paradox. There's a paradox then. So they're physically declining, yet emotionally and spiritually, they're very much alive. They're vibrant.
There's a growth. But you earlier you said something that they don't seem to be motivated by sharing this as much as, say, a near-death experience. It's more of an internal process.
Absolutely. I've never had a patient either wake up and say, "Hey, what do you think this means?" Never had it happen.
What first clued you into this? Was there one or two stories that made you wonder if there's some correlation?
And I think I wrote a book, and this is the story that kind of opened the book. Was that I had a young man who was dying of complications from HIV, and he was in his 40s, and I thought he had more time, and we could give IV fluids and antibiotics and whatnot. And I went back to the nurse's station, and I, did the doctor thing. Here's the orders I want to do. And she said, "Oh, he's dying of seeing his mom." And I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. And of course, she ended up being right. And the study we showed that you can prognosticate off of these experiences. And then, I have a PhD also in neurobiology, so I was pretty obsessed with, and this doesn't make any sense, even though it's always been in the humanities, it's in the literature, cross cultures throughout time. Plato talked about it, indigenous people have it in their belief systems, but very little in medicine. And, then I had a patient who was a woman who was nearing the end of her life, and towards the end of her life, she was cradling a baby and referred to him by name. And we didn't know who the baby was. And then the sister, but she was obviously at peace and comforted. And the sister came in from out of town and said, "Well, that name, that's the baby she lost." And that's when it just seemed to me that the issue it didn't matter whether I understood it. The intrinsic value was so clear for the patient, and that perhaps we should just have reference for it. And it wasn't, the fact that I understood it was irrelevant.
I would imagine this information changes the way one may work with the patient itself, right? When you're saying that this is not a dying person, this is a growing person, that changes the perspective.
And that's actually very well said. Yes. And that people don't stop living because they're dying.
Right. There's value in every day. Yeah. Very, very, very neat. I wonder, one of the things that have kind of interested me more, I was focused on healing addiction, and as part of my path of healing addiction. Although I grew up in a very Jewish Orthodox background, I stopped practicing. But as part of my process of recovering from addiction and recognizing that a spiritual worldview is, for many people, they have found it beneficial for healing from addiction. Eventually, that led me towards psychedelics and psychedelic therapy and having some of those experiences. And the shift that happened in my world, in the worldview from the psychedelic therapy, has altered the way that I see some of this kind of work and other work and how this can influence. Well, I recognize that that's not for everyone. I wonder what I wonder about work like this and getting out to more people. So have you seen, I asked a question earlier, but just in a different way. Have you seen changes from people who are working in the clinic with you? So maybe a doctor who always worked in ER and then suddenly comes into working in a palliative care or hospice unit. Have you seen that somehow it changes the way they themselves are living? Meaning instead of saying there's only the patient's going through a process, or the doctor's also going through a process that also could be measured, qualitative, and then if it is, then how can that extend to more of the population?
No, I haven't seen a single impact that I know of within medicine. And part of that is the structure of medicine, which is becoming more fragmented, more organ-based, so spot welders. The role of the primaries kind of dwindled. There's multiple layers of it, mid-levels. So I think we see less whole person care. You go to a doctor, you go to the kidney doctor, the lung doctor, but the looking after the person in totality is less common. I think where we're seeing enormous change is outside of medicine. This generation, the baby boomers, don't want their parents' death. They don't want institutionalized death. They want to be at home with their loved ones. They want a death in which they have a say. They don't want the doctor's death. They want dignity. They want comfort. So I think we're seeing an enormous cultural movement, but it's outside of medicine.
And your studies match very well with that movement.
Yeah.
Right.
And which is really what propelled it around the world is, like the books in 10 languages now. The Netflix thing went around the world. I mean, because there's receptivity. And it's and same with the TED Talk, right? There's 5.5 million views or whatever. It's not because the TED Talk's so good, it's because people want to have their experiences validated. They're curious about dying in their own life. They may be caretakers. So the momentum, my point is, the momentum isn't coming from our institutions of learning or medicine. They're coming from the people who receive care or are giving care as caregivers. They want to understand more. So the curiosity and the knowing and the interest is all outside of medicine.
So there's like, who is the giver and taker in that relationship is what you're saying, meaning there's the doctor, but the doctors have what to learn from the...
Yeah, I think the medical piece of this is becoming less relevant in the equation.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I think people, our parents' generation just did what the doctor said, and they were grateful for the care, and they weren't consumers of healthcare. Today's people want something very different. They don't want to sterilize. And they don't want to sterilize death. You ask people, the vast majority of Americans, 80% of them, don't want to die in the hospital, for example.
From when you were intrigued enough by that story and possibly others, the one you mentioned with the HIV patient, to embark on this study, did the study go as you thought, meaning you had a certain idea and here it was proven out? Or were there certain things that surprised you through the course of those studies? And if there was something that surprised you, what was it?
I think we wrote a paper on children. We have a large pediatric program here. And I think that was impressive, which is that they may not have known somebody who had died, but they often they have a better imaginative life and world in their head. And they often have animals that they know that have passed that come to them. And same idea that they're not alone, they're loved. I think people who are cognitively different, like dementia, we talk about them in terms of their deficits, but they all have emotional histories that they can draw from. I think those people aren't denied a rich end of life experience, which is fascinating. So I think those things. The other thing we did was that we learned a lot was that we got wrong was that there's a subset of people, about 17%, who are very negative end of life experiences. Basically people die as they live. And if you've had a traumatic or wounded life, those things aren't denied at the end. But what we missed was that those are often the most transformational, most meaningful, the negative ones.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. A veteran who served in World War II who had 67 years of post-trauma and enormous survivor's guilt. And at the end of the life, first of all, he lived horribly. He was involved in the invasion of Normandy, and he relived all the horrors of that, the blood, the bodies, the dying, the screaming. But then close to death, he had a dream where a soldier came to him on the shore and said, "We're coming for you." And then he passed. He slept, and he could pass.
And these experiences were awake or asleep?
Predominantly when they're asleep. They'll often record about almost half the time that they're asleep. They're probably lucid dreaming. They feel so real. So we asked them to fill out on a scale of 0 to 10 the degree of realism. And the most common number selected was 10. So these are very different than normal dreams. They're not tangential. They're not metaphorical. They're not fantastical. They're based on real occurrences from life. They're remembered. They're organized. And they feel like they happened. People are most adamant when they say, no, this is not like a normal dream.
So how do you understand those, say with this, the gentleman from World War II, right? So he had that experience at the end where the soldiers are coming and the others are saying, hey, that sense of comfort that he got. How do you understand the difficult experiences before leading up to that experience?
I think that, again, you die as you live. And, if you've been traumatized like that, that's a part of your identity. It's core to who you are. And it makes sense that, to me, that's reckoned with. So it feels like at the end of life, there's these series, for people like that, there's a series of reckonings or atonements. We had a mother whose child had been imprisoned multiple times for drug-related offense. So she felt like a failed parent. That was her identity. But at the end of the life, her parents come to her and tell her she was a good mom. So, we all have been harmed for living, and that's undeniable. And so there's something honest about this, I think. Truth comes out, I think.
Right. A lot of the other stuff kind of shift away. Earlier, when I was asking the question about the like doctors, I didn't mean did it impact their medical care. Do you see that it impacted others personally? Obviously, this has affected your life tremendously because you've done
very, very much. There's almost two camps. There's people, but the problem is there's a subset of doctors who they see this, people who are having an unshared reality, and they assume it's delirium or a confusional state.
Mm-hmm.
But there's doctors who get this in their bones. I mean, once they've experienced in their personal life, it tends to have a pretty profound impact.
So, and what is that change? Is there a way that you can define that? When I was saying, like, maybe to reverse it, right? Instead of studying the patient, study the medical staff and saying, hey, the medical staff who are experiencing this, is there something that they're being changed with? And now, someone 30 years old and for the rest of their life, they're impacted because for a couple of years they worked.
I think there's definitely some element of respect or regard for the for a spiritual aspect of something that's more abstract, that's unseen, that can't be imaged or biopsied. You can't help but be kind of changed.
Yeah, that's I guess what I'm going after. When you said with the the first time I guess a nurse told you, said, "Hey, this patient's dying. They just had dreams of someone." How close is that? What is the proximity of those dreams to dying? Did you measure that?
It's usually within a few weeks, like about 15 days. But we've had people who start having these experiences many months before. Yeah, it's usually within about a 2-week period.
Are there times that maybe someone can be in the process of dying, start having these dreams, and then something in their medical care shifts? Now they're doing better. And
That's funny. You're the only one who's ever asked me that. And yeah, we've had that happen quite a few times. So we've had, what's interesting is most of the people want to go back to having the dreams they had.
really,
We have an acute care unit for end of life, and periodically people get turned around, like they treated an infection or whatever, and they start eating after they're no longer constipated, and they go away. And then when they start to die again, it could be a year later, they come back. Yeah.
fascinating. There's a specific reason why I'm asking the question, is because I knew of a story going on where someone was very sick, and then just recently, it was maybe 6 weeks ago, and then it was a teenager. It was a teenager who was very sick, and she had reported to someone who mentioned it to me that, oh, she's having dreams of her grandma and grandpa. And I right away thought of your studies, and she's still alive today. So I'm asking the question from that perspective, and doing better. So I was wondering if there's...
Yeah. Was she near dying or?
Very sick. She was very sick, yeah.
Yeah, I think something happens. It's kind of understandable when we're faced to confront our mortality. There's no way you don't start reflecting. And I think these things creep in.
But some of it's beyond reflection, when they're dreams of someone, that like a lucid dream.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, it's beyond
Right.
it's beyond just a reminiscing. Yeah, 100%.
Got you. Are there other studies you're working on now as offshoots, or other interesting questions that you're researching at this stage?
I mean, we've done multiple large scale studies with the family, because how we see people leave us absolutely affects our bereavement. And the basic rules, what's good for the patient is good for the family. So death could be viewed as something empty and just tissue dying. But when families see that people aren't alone, that they're connected again to those they love, grief is different. And we've actually looked at the processing of grief, because there's tools for that, and people do better who've seen this sort of thing. The next series of studies we're doing are on transcendence. So we know these things occur. What does the patient interpret them as? So kind of back to your original question about what do you make sense of? First, we had to prove that they occur, and we had to show this is their frequency and this is the content they dream of. But now we're looking at how do they make sense of this? Does this change their worldview, their life view, their afterlife view? Does this confirm a religious belief? That kind of thing.
And are you early enough? Are you far enough along in the process to report any findings?
We've done a lot of patients. We just haven't done the analysis, but there's clearly a sense that this seems to make sense to people from their vantage point, that they're reconnected with certain people. The comfort makes sense to them, that they continue to exist, their love continues to exist, makes sense to them. So that's kind of where it's at.
And are you measuring from the outset whether their starting point for beliefs, or maybe a specific religion or no religion at all, or atheist?
We always do that. The problem is, people will often say, I'm Catholic because I was brought up in a church. But what is their actual belief system? Are they actually practicing? So people are funny when it comes to identifying themselves religiously.
Right.
I can report it, but I can't tell you how accurate it is, I guess.
Right. I'd kind of be curious to know if people shift from maybe a more materialistic worldview what I see and feel exists and what doesn't, what I can't doesn't, to having these experiences and something shifts, right? When you talk about near-death experiences, people have had those and they're forever shifted.
Oh,
from
God,
that.
yeah. But I can't tell you how different that is. Like they're transformed, right? This is an experience that just kind of seems to make sense to these people. It's weird.
Fascinating. If someone wants to learn more about your work, book to read, documentary to watch, what would you recommend?
Sure. So we have a website. It's Dr. Christopher with a C, Kerr, KER.com. There's a lot of patient videos in there. You can also put my name in TED Talk. There's a TED Talk because I really think what's important is to not hear from me, but listen to our patients and families in the videos. There's a book by Penguin Random House called Death is But a Dream. We're in a Netflix series episode 5 called Surviving Death. So those are the kind of the points I'd refer to.
Gotcha. What's your motivation to do this? Meaning beyond working with the patients, but to not only study it and research it, but get on TED Talks, have conversations like we're having here, write books about it. What message are you trying to share?
I
with the wider
I
world?
wanted nothing to do with any of it.
I see.
If I had my way, I still wouldn't be doing it. I'm an unlikely messenger. I think what keeps me going is there's not a day that goes by I don't hear from somebody around the world grateful that what they've witnessed or experienced is validated. And so if you look at the TED Talk, what's fascinating isn't the TED Talk. What's fascinating is the 7,000 replies or whatever it is, where people are sharing their experiences. So all I've done, there's no real discovery here. This has always been known. I put it in doctor speak, but I provided a context for people to feel like, that's thank you. That's what I saw or experienced. So that's, if you ask what the motivation is, I guess is to continue to serve some earthly good, and because they're not used to hearing from doctors in this way, that this was real common and okay, and yes, you're not confused and you're not losing your mind. That matters, I think.
Interesting. Wasn't the answer I would have expected. The message isn't necessarily for the wider world, but it's for the people who are experiencing it to be able to put some language and confirmation to their experiences.
I got to tell you, there are people who write me or reach out to me who can provide me better insight than I have. But it's remarkable what it's meant to their grief. It's what they've learned about their parent. I've had people write me who said, I can't believe I've learned this about a parent who they didn't understand. The reassurance and comfort they felt. It's really inspiring. But again, it's not coming from medicine, it's coming from the receivers of care. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah,
but it was never my ambition to do this.
It just kind of unfolded.
Well, I tell you exactly what happened is I was teaching medical students and residents back in like 2000. And I'm basically saying, guys, this stuff actually happens and it matters. And we live in an evidence-based time. And they would look up on the computer, they go, well, there's no evidence for this. I did the studies to prove what I already knew, so I could say, there's the evidence.
Right.
And now, 15,000 patients later, so we inadvertently created our own evidence base, but it was meant for medical education. And what happened is it seeped into the popular press, ended up in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and da-da-da. That's what happened. And it just blazed a trail, and the momentum was coming from the non-medical community. So I had one intended audience, which was medical students, and where I never got any traction, and it seeped out everywhere else. That's what happened.
And you probably still haven't got much traction there.
That's a mountain that's not going to move in my lifetime.
So what do you make of that? I mean, I guess if I was talking
the science of medicine has outstripped its art. We are forever enamored with the idea that we can understand things in concrete terms. We can image them, whatever, biopsy them. And we don't view dying necessarily as part of the life, a natural occurrence, but an enemy that we're going to fight. And we view dying as medical failure, like, that we didn't cure, reverse, whatever. And of course we don't. So medicines become progressively more uncomfortable with dying, and we abandon the dying because we say things like there's nothing more we can do for you, which really means that there's nothing more we can do to you. And the doctor of old, the old guy who got in his horse and buggy and went to the patient's home, didn't just walk away. She knew that presence mattered, that where our oath is actually to cure where possible, to comfort always. And we've forgotten the second part of that. We cure, but we don't seem capable of comforting always.
Interesting. I'm thinking of the work, David Hawkins. He wrote a number of books on transcendence, also a medical doctor. So he speaks a lot about, I was reading a book of his recently, I think it's called Power versus Force. And he kind of made the same point, but in a different way. So about kinesiology, it's called. So it's very difficult to measure, but he's done studies. It's very difficult to understand from a scientific perspective. How would the body know if someone's holding in an envelope of vitamin C versus a sugar? But he tested, the body's reaction to those things, and conclusively was able to prove that the body somehow knows what's in that envelope and will react to it. But within the medical community, even though his studies he says are conclusive, I haven't read them or understood it, just how rejected they were because it didn't fit into that neat box. And I think he used a similar term of science versus art. So,
yeah, if we can't.
He broadened it beyond the way you said it, just about death. That it's death they were uncomfortable with and not being able to cure. It's just if I can't measure it, if I can't understand it, it absolutely doesn't.
Yeah.
It absolutely doesn't exist. Okay, interesting. That's one of like I mentioned earlier, and part of the reason that I have these conversations and others is that there are certain parts of my worldview that change that I found very helpful to the way I'm living today. But if I was saying it to myself 10 years ago, me talking to myself 10 years ago, some of these ideas would have felt too spiritual or floofy or otherwise. But what's interesting is you only need one of these to be right. I only have to have a conversation with like you and 1,000 others who have found something that's slightly paranormal or not quite understood, even though you said it isn't paranormal, for that materialistic worldview just to be not everything it is. Meaning not everyone has to be right, just one. And then the whole worldview is shattered.
Makes you more curious.
Right. And I wondered how we got to a place that it's so, different kind of things. Like a pill is understood and it's like, okay, take a pill and it's going to heal you. But, acupuncture, kinesiology must be crazy. But we haven't actually looked and studied all of those things.
It's an interesting time.
So fascinating. And you're seeing it especially obviously with...
We just aren't capable of trusting our senses, right? Things like intuition.
Right.
Understanding and yeah.
Okay, great. I hope those who listen